Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my 2010 Vauxhall Vivaro Campervan here in the lovely British summer weather. So, because I've had this van converted for about 2 years, what I thought I wanted to do was go back through all of that old footage and put together a full video of the whole conversion from start to finish. Now, if you're interested in learning more about the layout of the van and how it all fits together and the features, then I've got a full walkthrough video you can watch here. But if you're interested in learning more about the step-by-step process and how I put the whole thing together, I have a 14-episode playlist available for you to watch on the whole conversion as well. But that's enough of me yabbering on. Let's get on with the conversion video.
The first thing I had to do was gut and clean the van. Now, this thing was absolutely filthy and it took a whole day just to clean it out. I started by removing all of the wooden ply panelling from the walls, which was fairly easy. It was only 4mm ply and the screws came out with no bother. The floor was a much harder job, however. The screws had rusted away, and so I had to use the angle grinder to cut the heads of the screws and then ply the wood from the floor. Once the floor was up, I had to brush out all of the dirt and grime that had built up from it being a builder's van for the last 10 years. After that, I just had to grind down the last of the screws that were poking up still, and then it was time for a deep clean and a few rust repairs with some Q rust. Once the van was clean, I set to insulating and installing the new floor. I started by using this hard insulating foam, which I cut to size and fixed to the inner grooves of the van floor using some spray adhesive. I left the metal grooves exposed as I would use them to glue down my new wooden floor, but before I did that, I needed to fit the carpet to the wheel arches using that same spray adhesive. I opted for carpet over building a wooden box around them as I was trying to maximise as much space as I could in such a small van. I ordered a pre-cut plywood floor online as it saved a lot of time trying to measure the whole thing out and do it myself, and I had no doubt that I would definitely mess that up, so I thought this way would be much better despite costing me a little bit more. I glued my pre-cut plywood floor to the base of the van and left some logs on it to keep it pressed down while I set to work installing the rear door ladder. Now, I hate drilling holes in my van, so I got my dad to help me to make sure I didn't f*** it up, but this thing works a treat and I use it all the time to access the roof. After that was all done, I set to installing my second floor. For this, I use normal vinyl flooring planks. You can pick these up from any sort of hardware store, and I opted for these because I knew they would be tough, they were thin, and they didn't lose much height in the ceiling, and I think they look great. Now, I just used some super strong glue to stick the floor down straight onto the wooden ply floor. I was super happy with the finished result, and I suggest that anyone doing a van do the floor like this. The only caveat is that it is a little bit heavier than just straightforward ply. I then set to bolting my jerry can to the other back door. Now, the frame to secure it was missing a couple of holes, so once I drilled them, I could bolt it straight to the door, which meant drilling more holes in the van. I love the look of this thing, and it's really useful for carrying my shower water. Next up, I fixed some wooden framing to the ceiling. I used thin strips of wood that slotted really nicely into the steel frame of the van, which meant I could fix these up with just a single screw in the centre, and a slightly more fiddly one at the front of the van. I then used some 1.5mm twin core cable, which I ran all over the van that would be the basis of my 12-volt electrical system. I had this all mapped out in my head beforehand, so I knew where all the wires needed to go and how many. After that, I wanted to protect the fresh cut vinyl flooring to stop it from deteriorating. I couldn't find anything that would quite work, so I ended up using this special hard tape which you're meant to use to stick wires down to the floor with so you can walk over them. It was pretty stiff and hard to fit, and in all honesty, I didn't do the best job. I'll try and avoid this material if you're doing a van, because after a year, it just completely fell apart. Next up was to bolt my solar panel to the roof of the van. I used some metal fixing plates and bolts to secure it to the roof rack, and this was a very fiddly job and it was not easy at all. But with a bit of persistence, it was all sorted. I also then drilled a couple small holes to run the wires through a little waterproof housing box, which was fixed to the roof using sealant and a couple small bolts. Next up was to fix my decking boards to the roof rack to create myself a little walkway so I could access the roof box, which is where I like to store all of my kit. Now, rather unintentionally, this ended up actually serving as a great terrace where you can set up a few small chairs and table and enjoy a sunset a little higher up than the other campers. I wanted to install a projector, so to make this work I had to wire in a HDMI cable into the van, which is what I was doing here. And then after that, I took a step back and mapped out the entire layout of the van. Now this really helped me visualize where things were going to go and if everything was going to fit where I wanted it to. This is a super important step of any van build and I highly recommend everyone does it. It helps you avoid any costly mistakes and also helps you create a little checklist of where to start first. I used masking tape and I let this down on the floor for the rest of the build. Once I had the design all mapped out, I started the real build. and I got to work putting a basic frame together for the side unit that runs parallel to the bed. For all the framing on this van, I used 2x1 pine battens. I could have easily used 2x2, but frankly 2x1 was strong enough and of course a lot cheaper. As the frame started to come together, I quickly filled in one of the main holes in the side of the van with insulation and covered it with a sheet of 9mm ply. But I had to hammer out a few pieces of metal that were sticking out from the van. And after all that was done, it was back to building the frame. I'll be honest, when I was building this, I didn't really have much of a plan. I just threw a bunch of wood together and hoped it would work, and then adapted the design as I went along. To keep the front unit flush, I cut notches out of the cross beams so they could pass through each other and be supported at the same time. I then cut a section of 9mm ply to size and screwed this to the underside of the top unit to create a 2-inch deep shelf which I would use for loose storage of small things. I then continued to add 9mm ply to separate out the cupboard sections and add an end piece on which would create some storage compartments at the back, as well as a small cutout for a switchboard that would have 2 USB slots and a 12-volt socket. After that, it was time to measure up the overhead cupboards and start putting them together. I used the same 2x1 to build a basic outer frame and screw it straight into the ceiling. I could then measure up the next 2 dimensions of it, which I would screw straight into the metal frame of the van. And after that, I was ready to move on to running the cables for the LED strip lights, which I was going to fit later in the build. After that, I started to cut some more 9mm ply for the outsides of the cupboards to box them in, and then I screwed a little divider between the two of them to turn one cupboard into 2. I then decided to begin building the bed frame. Now I wanted a big drawer at the back that pulls out, so that's where I started first. I cut 2x1 planks down to size, and then taking a notch out of the top so that when I screwed them together the frame would be stronger. I always started by building a box shape to begin with and then adding more dimensions as I went along. After building out the 2 identical square frames, I cut to size 4 main cross beams and then screwed the whole thing together. At the end, I added in 2 smaller supports in the high traffic areas where I was going to be sitting up and down a lot. Now it was on to the more complicated section of the bed, which is the bit that slides out. I started by just brainstorming and mapping out how this would look, and I decided to run a long 2x1 beam at the back, which was fixed in place by a support at the rear, a shorter block that rested on the wheel arch, and then 2 further down straight onto the floor of the van. This way I had support running the entire length of the bed from one piece of wood. Then it was time to build the longer side of the sliding bed. I again started by building a 4-sided frame from 2x1, but I doubled up the supports in the middle of the 2 pieces of wood. I could then make an almost identical box again, which would form the main frame and the legs that eventually pull out. Then came the fiddly bit. I used a smaller piece of 1x1 that would form part of the rails that the sliding part of the bed would run on. Now this wasn't necessarily structural and so didn't need to be that strong. I then secured a smaller piece of wood that would be the free moving part that would slide along the 1x1 I just fitted. Now I made sure to cut out some small notches so there wouldn't be too much drag on the bed slats as they slide over the main frame. Once that was all lined up, all I had to do was cut the bed slats down to size and then screw them in place. I made sure to alternate them, fixing one to the back box frame, which stays fixed, and then the next one to the sliding part of the frame, which moves freely. For the top end of the bed, I used the same old 18mm ply that I had lying around from the old van, which I decided to repurpose. I cut it down to size using the jigsaw, making sure it could fit around the metal frame of the van. And that was the bed done. Following that, I began to make the shaker style doors and panels for the side unit. Now these were all different sizes, so I ordered them all cut to size, and all I needed to do was cut some thin pine strips and glue them on. This way took up a lot more time and effort, but I was working on a tight budget and custom shaker doors aren't cheap. Now whilst they were drying, I set to cutting out and fixing in a divider for the space beneath the bed, turning one open space into 2 separate storage compartments. By the time I'd installed that, I could swap over the clamps and start gluing some more shaker cupboards. Whilst the second set was drying, I cut out some smaller ends of the bed slats, which I would screw onto the sliding part of the bed just to clean up the look. Then, with the help of my old man, we got started on the front of the kitchen by beginning to put together the wooden frame, again using that same 2x1 framing. And after about an hour or so, it was beginning to take shape. We followed that by adding further dimensions to it at the base and then fixing the bottom to the main structure of the van where the bulkhead used to bolt into. Now, by this time, winter was fast approaching, so I put up an old marquee that we had to act as a kind of temporary workshop that would allow me to be able to work on the van throughout the winter. And with the van's new home all set up, it was ready to go back to work on the main kitchen framing. There wasn't much of a design plan that we were following. This was more throwing a rough kind of structure together and then figuring it out as we went along, which I appreciate isn't helpful, but hopefully you get a better idea from these clips. Essentially, we built it as a removable structure that we could then just bolt onto the bulkhead of the van when fully complete. This meant we could construct it outside of the van where we had more space to work. I'd recommend doing your own conversion in this kind of modular style as it made for a much easier process. Now for the kitchen, I left the back braces of it exposed and I tapered them as they rose upwards so they fitted nicely in with the back of the driver's seat, and this would be the frame for the kitchen splashback. After that, I set to cutting various sections of 9mm ply for panelling around the van, focusing first here on the rear section of the bed frame, which makes up that L shape of the sofa. I then turned my attention to putting together the set of drawers that would form part of the kitchen off to one side. Now these would house my electrics, and above that there'd be two drawers, one for pots and pans, and other for just normal utensils. I started by putting together two basic outer rectangular frames, and then joining these together to make a complete unit. Again, I wasn't really following a specific plan, just kind of adding to it as I went along. I cut out some 9mm ply to make up the base on which all of my electrics would sit. Now I kept the base raised on top of a 2-inch frame just to make sure that all the wires would be able to run underneath and be hidden from view. After that, I added two sets of horizontal bits of framing that would be the point where I attached my drawer runners to, which I would eventually fit later. After I lost the light that evening, I cut out some 9mm ply for the wall, making sure to also cut out a section for the wheel arch. Now I used ply over cladding to keep costs down, and since it would mostly be hidden by the bed, it wouldn't be seen anyway. And before fitting it, I added some fiberglass insulation. I called it a night after that, and early the next morning began working on the main kitchen unit, fixing in more wood that would make up the platform that my gas bottle would sit on. Now I opted to do things this way round to maximise space, and although unconventional, it has worked great for me, and I've had no issues over the last couple of years having this set up. With that done, I moved on to building more of the framing, this time for the 3 small drawers that would sit within the main kitchen structure. It was a fairly straightforward process of just adding in some notched bits of 2x1 to the smaller drawers could run on. Once that was finished, I started on the ceiling cladding. For this, I reused the cladding from my old van, cut it back down to size and screwed it directly into the ceiling frame that I'd installed earlier in the build. Now I made sure to insulate as I went along, and I had holes pre-cut for ceiling lights from the old van. And by the following afternoon, I had the whole ceiling done. After that, I moved on to cladding the back doors. Now, because the back doors don't have any sensible place to screw cladding into, I had to start by screwing in some 1x1 battens, which would hold the screws for the cladding. Now, the cladding took ages as I had to cut and shape every piece of wood to the exact size, which wasn't easy. And then I just had to repeat this process on both the top and bottom sections of both doors. After that, I started drilling some holes in the framing of the van so that I could run my wires through. Now this way it kept all of the wires nice and tidy behind the panelling and free from any insulation. And I also made sure to label the ends of the wires so that I could connect them all up to the fuse box later in the right order. After connecting my main leisure batteries together, I boxed it all in with some 9mm ply before fixing the electrical components to the base drawer unit ready to fit. I also then fitted a mains plug to the kitchen frame, which would be used for where I plugged the fridge into, as well as an isolator switch for all of the electrics. I then left the electrics for the time being and set to work on my kitchen worktop. For this build, I used 2 scaffolding boards, like the ones that you see on a building site, although I bought these ones new. I started by removing the metal ends and cutting a new straight edge onto the side. I then cut the boards at a 45-degree angle so that they would fit together more cleanly, and that would look better on the main right-hand turn of the worktop. After a lot of sanding and shaping, I was finally ready to glue the 2 pieces together and hold them in place with some clamps and a long screw. Whilst the glue was drying, I went back to the electrics. This time I was running all of the 12-volt cables to the fuse box and other electrical components. And once everything was all connected, it was time to test the lights. Now this was a big moment in the build and gave me some much needed motivation to crack on even more, despite the weather being absolutely filthy for the next few days. Once the glue for the worktop was dry, I got to work on the second scaffolding board, and I followed the exact same process for this one. Although, once you start sticking 4 separate pieces of wood together, which all have a tendency to warp, especially in the winter weather, it started to get pretty fiddly. But with some persistence, I managed to glue the third piece of the worktop, and whilst I let that dry, I took the opportunity to carpet the inside of the side unit, which I use for loose storage. This gave it a much nicer feel every time you grab something, and to stick that down I used the same spray adhesive from earlier in the build. After that, the glue hadn't dried quite yet, so I set to cladding one of the walls with the same tongue and groove that I'd used in the ceiling of my previous van. I called it a night, and by the next morning the glue had set and it was time to work on the final piece of the worktop. Whilst I let the glue set for a final time, I got back to work on the cladding, as well as wiring in the light switch and plug sockets. The next day I began working on the second worktop in the van. Now this would be for the side unit that runs the length of the van. I managed to salvage an old pine shelf that was the perfect size and thickness, which was a bonus. I started by cutting it down to size and then fitting the hinges, as this thing would lift up to reveal those 3 storage compartments beneath it. Whilst I let the varnish dry, I started on the final set of tongue and groove cladding along the main side of the van, making sure to use as much of the old cladding as I could. I would pick out pieces that were close to the right size so that I didn't have to cut them too much. The only issue with this is that I did have a few old screw holes in random places, but it probably saved me hundreds of pounds, and so for that reason I didn't care. I could always fill them in later. Along the way, I installed a small reading light which doubles as a light for the rear drawer when you open it up at night. Now this was an unintended feature, but I'm so glad it turned out this way. The next morning it was back to varnishing and carrying on with the cladding. I brushed on another coat and then cut and trimmed the tongue and groove down to size. I fixed this in place on the central batten and the metal frame of the van, and whilst I went along I also wired in my USB port in the kitchen that would be used to charge phones and GoPros and things like that. By that afternoon I had the whole sidewall finished, and still with the little time left in the day I cut another piece of 9mm ply which I would use for the side of the set of drawers. The next morning I set to work on the 3 smaller drawers that sit in the main part of the kitchen. For these I used some 9mm ply, some wood glue and a few small screws, and made some pretty straightforward 5-sided boxes. Once these were all fitted, I then screwed in some 1x1 as a small guide rail for the drawers so that they could slide in a lot easier. Once those are finished, my dad and I worked together to cut out the main hole in the worktop that would hold the cooker and the sink unit. Now this was a very precise bit of measuring that took a few attempts with the blueprint that we had, but after an hour or so we were ready to start cutting. Once the hole had been cut with only one tiny error, I sanded down the worktop and began the first of 3 coats of varnish. Again, I used the same colour varnish as the other worktop so that theme would run throughout the entire van. Now whilst the second coat was drying, I got to work sticking on these fake tiles to make the splashback of the kitchen. Now these weren't actually tiles, they were actually just stickers, but this was a great alternative to using real tiles. They were light, cheap and super easy to fit. Again, I recommend this option if you're trying to keep the weight down. I then set to starting to prime the cupboard doors as well as the overhead cupboards ready for painting at another time. And whilst that paint was drying, I decided to fit the LED strip lights which would run the length of both sides of the van, but I needed to run to the store to get more supplies, and at the same time I picked up the main paint for the van, and when I got back I started doing the first coat of paint on the cupboard doors, and whilst I waited for that to dry I set to work on cladding the inside of the sliding door. The next morning it was back to the LED strip lights. I decided to grab a small piece of skirting wood that I would stain, which would kind of hide the lights behind and make it look really neat and tidy. And in between all of that I recruited the help of my sister to get some more of the painting done of the main kitchen frame. Next up was to get the bulk of all the painting finished. So I started with the bed frame, and whilst that was drying I set to auto-carping all of the exposed metal framing on the van. This makes it look a lot nicer and also stops any condensation from forming on those colder nights. Again, I used the same spray adhesive that I'd been using before. Once that was finished, my dad and I worked on building the larger drawers for the van, making sure to varnish them to protect the inside. Again, these were pretty straightforward 5-sided boxes. After that, I set to working on the overhead cupboard fronts. I used the same method of a sheet of 12mm ply with a 4mm shaker strip on the outside to keep the theme consistent throughout. Whilst those are drying, we set to fixing the main sink unit to the worktop for good. We hooked up the gas, gave it a little test run and checked for any leaks in the system. With that all working as it should, I then fitted all of the main drawers to the van, putting them on soft close drawer runners, before fixing in the overhead cupboards on their hinges with a small catch to hold them open, as well as fixing in the larger cupboard doors on their hinges behind which I store my water tanks. I used some 18mm ply fronts for the 3 smaller drawers which only needed some paint to finish. However, for the drawer front that hides the electrics, I fixed in some magnets to hold it in place, as a hinge would restrict access. I was then pretty close to the finishing touches, which involved cutting out all of the necessary pieces of 9mm ply, which I could use to cover any parts of the build that I wouldn't typically see. I hooked up my water pump and gave that a quick test run, and all was working great. After that, I wired in the switchboard at the back of the van, which I would use for the portable shower and to charge various bits and bobs like cameras. I then went inside to cut up an old memory foam mattress, which I needed to turn into 3 separate cushions to form the bed. Now, I wasn't able to do it all in one piece because of the geometry, so I cut a 9mm backboard which would provide some support for the cushion that would form both the back of the sofa and the mattress section for the bed that extended out. Now, I glued this on again using that same spray adhesive as before. Once that was done, I decided to fit on all of the drawer handles and knobs. I opted for gold as I thought it contrasted really nicely with the navy paint for the kitchen. And aside from that, it was just a case of gluing on all of the rest of the cupboard fronts and then installing them for good. Once that was finished, I bought a doormat from B&Q, cut it to size, and then glued that to the main step of the van as a place to wipe your feet before you step in. I then fitted the cupboard fronts to the underside of the bed and added in 2 more gold handles. Now I keep 2 small wooden crates inside these, which I use for storage for things like bedding and other random larger bits like towels and dry robes and stuff like that. After that was all done, all I had to do was fix the bed in place, and that was the van complete.
So there you have it. That is how I converted this 2010 Vauxhall Vivaro panel van into my own little camper van and home on wheels. Now, if you're interested and want to follow along for more, then hit that subscribe button for plenty more related content on my channel. But as always, people, that's it from me, and I will see you in the next one.